Romeo and Juliet is always described as this like unrealistic love story.
It will be a love story.
Romeo and Juliet, which was written hundreds of years ago, it was like the one true first sort of great love story.
Because it's Shakespearean's greatest love story.
The greatest love story of all time. Romeo and Juliet.
I mean, it is the classic, masterpiece of love stories.
A bold reimagining of this classic love story.
This is Romeo and Juliet, often called the greatest love story of all time.
Okay, so quick recap for anyone who needs it. Often called the greatest love story of all time, in Romeo and Juliet there are these two warring families whose kids fall in love when they see each other through a fish tank. They get married in secret, and shortly after Romeo gets into a fight with Juliet's cousin Tybalt, who ends up dead.
So Tybalt kills Mercutio, and then Romeo kills Tybalt.
Juliet's parents want her to marry some guy called Paris, but she's already gone ahead and married Romeo. So, the priest Friar Lawrence poisons her so that it seems like she's dead, so she can get out of the arranged marriage. Sends for Romeo to be there when she wakes up, while her family thinks she's lying around waiting to be buried. But Romeo, who's been banished from the city, doesn't get the message from Friar Lawrence, but does hear that Juliet has died.
I defy you, stars!
Devastated, he turns up to the chapel where Juliet is buried with a vial of real poison, drinks the whole thing and dies, just as she wakes up. Juliet sees his corpse, takes his dagger, and kills herself. The story ends when the families and the Prince of Verona find their bodies, and the prince is like, "Look at what your fighting has done." Part 1. Is Romeo and Juliet a love story? Okay, so following the prologue, more on that later, and a big world-establishing street fight scene, we meet Romeo. He's mooning about like the angsty teenager he is, sulking over some girl called Rosaline.
Sad hours seem long.
What sadness lengthens Romeo's hours?
Not having that which having makes them short.
We also get to hear some of Romeo's terrible sad boy poetry.
Feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health.
And some classic Shakespeare bawdiness.
She will not stay the siege of loving terms, nor bide the encounter of assailing eyes, nor ope her lap to saint-seducing gold.
And she hath sworn that she will still live chaste.
So what does this tell us about Romeo? Well, that he's horny for one thing.
Shakespeare.
He is desperate for this Rosalind girl to ope her lap. But do we ever get to meet this Rosalind? No. She only exists on the outskirts of the play so that we can understand that Romeo is kind of a player. As soon as he meets Juliet in Act 1, Scene 5, we never hear about Rosaline again. Except for when Friar Lawrence asks, "Hold on, who the hell is Juliet?"
Is Rosaline, that thou didst love so dear, so soon forsaken? Young men's love, then, lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes.
Until that point, poor old Rosalind's name is only mentioned a grand total of 3 times, and only once by Romeo. So, I think it'd be fair to say that Romeo probably doesn't really love Rosaline. But then, so why should we think he really loves Juliet? Let's take a look at Juliet's circumstances at the beginning of the play. When we meet Juliet, she's only 13.
Thou know'st my daughter's of a pretty age.
Faith, I can tell her age unto an hour.
She's not 14.
She's 13 years old.
That's right, yeah.
I'm not surprised the families are trying to split them up then. I'd have rang the police.
Despite her young age, her mother is already asking,
"Daughter Juliet, how stands your disposition to be married?"
It is an honour that I dream not of.
This line is usually interpreted as, "I wouldn't dream of it," but I think we could also read it as, "It's not even something I think about." After some jovial back and forth between the women, Juliet's mother puts it plainly.
Speak briefly. Can you like of Paris's love?
I look to like, if looking liking move. But no more deep will I endart mine eye than your consent give strength to make it fly.
And then it's party time. The next time we see Juliet, she's being introduced to Paris, and Romeo spots her on his arm.
But did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight, for I never saw true beauty till this night.
Dude, you were literally moping about Rosalind like 2 hours ago?
Slut. Wow.
Forgoing her mother's consent, Juliet promptly goes nuts for Romeo after he approaches her and immediately wants to make out. The very first words he says to her are,
If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle vine is this.
My lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss.
Yeah, smooth pickup line. Wouldn't you say at this point it's kind of fair to call Romeo a player? The next time they see each other in the infamous balcony scene, they agree to get married. Quick nerdy side note, Shakespeare never said there was a balcony. Besides the fact that there was no such thing as a balcony in 1590s England because it was too cold for them, Shakespeare never wrote stage directions, with the sole exception of the famous exit pursued by a bear in The Winter's Tale. There's various theories as to how this non-existent balcony made its way into the collective consciousness to become arguably the most famous theatre scene in the English language, but it essentially boils down to the fact that this guy, Thomas Otway, staged an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet called The History and Fall of Caius Marius, featuring both a balcony and those famous lines. Oh. Marius, Marius.
Wherefore art thou?
Marius. The balcony was later adopted for productions of Romeo and Juliet so frequently that it became linked with the play forever, despite Shakespeare never having mentioned a balcony. This is a great example of how what we call the production history of a play can skew people's ideas of what the original play really contains.
Romeo, oh Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?
Anyway, back to the play. So, we've established that Romeo and Juliet literally meet and agree to marry in one night, despite Romeo's insistence that he was madly in love with someone else earlier that day, and Juliet saying that she would never even look to like a man without her mother's consent. So what would motivate two teenagers to run away together so quickly? Well, the very first thing we learn in the play is that the Montagues and the Capulets are embroiled in some kind of civil war.
Two households, both alike in dignity.
In fair Verona, where we lay our scene.
From ancient blood break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean.
And the first scene of the play following the prologue shows us the violence of the world our title characters inhabit. Gregory and Samson, two men of the House of Capulet, make disgusting jokes about beheading Montague men and raping Montague women.
When I fought with the men, I will be civil with the maids. I will cut off their heads.
The heads of the maids. Aye, the heads of the maids or their maiden heads. Take it in what sense thou wilt.
As a Montague, Romeo has almost certainly been involved in many street fights like this. Lady Montague's line.
Where is Romeo? Saw you him today?
Right glad I am he was not at this fray.
Might suggest that normally he would be. His family members discuss his despondency and wonder what's been causing it.
Many a morning hath he there been seen, with tears augmenting the fresh morning's dew,
adding to clouds more clouds with his deep sighs.
Away from light steals home my heavy son. Private in his chamber pens himself.
Shuts up his windows, locks fair daylight out, and makes himself an artificial night.
Before Romeo tells Benvolio that the source of his dour mood is the lack of Rosalind's love, or so he says, he expresses dismay at a fight having taken place.
Oh me, what fray was here? Yet tell me not, for I've heard it all.
Could living in constant fear of getting into pointless street fights possibly be the real cause of his sadness? Juliet, on the other hand, leads a very sheltered life. She obeys her parents, and unlike Romeo, seems to have no friends her own age, only the nurse. In the first scene we meet him, her father Lord Capulet tells Paris that he can only marry Juliet if she agrees to it.
My child is yet a stranger in the world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years.
But 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride.
But then later, after Tybalt has died, he does a complete 180 and tries to force her to marry Paris, and threatens to throw her out onto the street and never speak to her again if she won't. Bear in mind, this is the first time in the play that Lord Capulet speaks to Juliet.
An you be mine, I'll give you to my friend. An you be not, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. By myself, I'll ne'er acknowledge thee.
So, Juliet, under the protection and strict control of her parents, leads a very restrictive and sheltered life. When she meets Romeo at the Capulet ball, Juliet sees a way out. We can see that she's still childish and naive when Romeo tries to immediately kiss her.
I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this.
My lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch, the tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much.
Which mannerly devotion shows in this? For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch.
And palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss.
While rereading the play for this video essay, I noticed for literally the first time that there's a prologue to Act 2. And in it, Shakespeare actually tells us that Romeo and Juliet are alike bewitched by the charm of looks. Part 2. Tragedy and Fate. What is a tragedy? As in, to give the play its full title, The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. It's a story with a sad ending, right? Well, yes and no. When dramatists talk about tragedies, especially in Shakespeare's day, they're usually talking about Greek and Roman tragedies, the definition of which scholars have been arguing over for thousands of years. In his famous work Poetics, Aristotle said that tragedy, then, is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear, effecting the proper purgation of these emotions.
Huh?
This is what we call catharsis.
What?
The word for when you watch the first 10 minutes of Up and then feel better afterwards, after you've had a big cry. Essentially, Aristotle said that the function of tragedy is to purge emotions.
Oh.
We usually associate tragedy with negative emotions, but not only so-called bad emotions can go through catharsis. We don't have a full definition of comedy from Aristotle. Like many Greek texts, his work examining comedy has largely been lost. But generally, our traditional understanding of comedy is that unlike tragedy, which usually ends in catastrophe, it usually concludes with a happy ending. In Shakespeare, this is often represented by a wedding. In a comedy, the characters overcome obstacles and social order is restored. You might have learned in school that in a tragedy, Greek, Roman, or Shakespearean, the protagonist has a fatal flaw, a character defect, often hubris or arrogance, and that leads to their downfall or death at the end of the play.
He clearly has mental health issues and crazy guilt coupled with addiction. That's all this is, and it's sad.
For example, Macbeth's arrogant ambition leads him to kill the king, setting off a chain of events that leads to his death. This is the flaw that leads to his fate. But this isn't quite right either. It's been argued that it's a bit of an invention by the moralistic Victorians. As Brian Dorries, artistic director of Theatre of War Productions in New York, puts it, the ancient Greek word commonly translated in textbooks as flaw, hamartia, more accurately means error, from the verb hamartano, to miss the mark. Centuries later, by the time of the New Testament, the same word, hamartia, came to mean sin, fully loaded with all its moral judgments. In other words, tragedies depict characters making mistakes rather than inherent flaws in character. Characters in Greek tragedies stray, err, and get lost. They are no more flawed than the rest of humanity. The difference lies in the scale of their mistakes, which inevitably cost lives and ruin generations. People, represented by tragic protagonists, the Greeks would tell you, aren't good or bad, but somewhere in between. Our flaws are not in ourselves, but in our actions. So, the old understanding of an inherent and inevitable fatal flaw isn't what causes the hero's downfall, but rather their actions. But I'd argue that fate still has a part to play in Romeo and Juliet. After all, the play opens by directly telling us what's going to happen in the prologue.
From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove.
By opening the play this way, Shakespeare sets up a world in which it's inevitable that Romeo and Juliet will die. Apparently, Shakespeare, an actor as well as a writer, may have played this part of the chorus himself. So Shakespeare literally stood on stage and told us as much. But why does Shakespeare set up a world in which it's inevitable that they'll die? Even Romeo seems to know that something is going to go wrong.
For my mind misgives some consequence, yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast with some vile forfeit of untimely death.
In tragedy, the concept of fate is not mutually exclusive of the existence of free will, nor does the ancient idea of destiny negate the role of personal choice and human agency. In fact, as in the case of Oedipus, human choices and actions are required in order to fulfill an individual's fate or destiny. Type 2 diabetes is a fitting metaphor for the human condition as portrayed in ancient Greek tragedy, and for the interdependence of human action and fate. Those who are diagnosed with the disease often possess a genetic predisposition to develop it. It is written into their DNA, like an ancient intergenerational curse. And yet, what diabetics choose to do with the knowledge of their condition has a direct impact on their lives and upon those who love them. As many as 60% of type 2 diabetics do not adhere to the recommendations of their doctors or faithfully take their medication. Fate refers to the cards we are dealt, the portion we were given at birth. Tragedy depicts how our choices and actions shape our destiny. No one ever said that change was easy, but my father believed it was impossible. Nothing infuriated me more than to listen to him rationalize his own self-destruction. In the heat of one memorable argument, he eyed the collection of Sophocles plays I had under my arm and asked, "Don't you believe in fate, Brian? All those Greek plays end in disaster, no matter what the characters try to do. Fate and free will are not mutually exclusive in ancient Greek tragedy. Fate always requires human action, or inaction, in order to be fulfilled. Greek tragedy was designed to promote the possibility of change. In other words, the fate that awaited Oedipus was avoidable, as was my father's, so is yours, and so is mine." Part 3, kind of, trauma.
My name is Bessel van der Kolk, and I am the author of the book The Body Keeps the Score. People usually think about the military when they talk about trauma, but when we started to work with inner city kids, the amount of trauma that these kids experienced was just unspeakable. An event becomes traumatic when there is nothing you can do to stave off the inevitable, and your body starts automatically going into a state of fight, flight, or collapse. The lingering effect of trauma is that you continue to react to mild stressors as if your life is in danger.
What? There's that slave come hither to flee and scorn at our solemnity? Now, by the stock and honor of my kin, to strike him dead, I hold it not a sin.
Quite the overreaction to someone gate-crashing your uncle's party. What could be causing this overreaction? Epigenetics is a relatively new area of research. It posits that, like our ability to genetically inherit diseases, like diabetes, we can also inherit traits which aren't necessarily physical. In a controversial 2013 study, Brian G. Dias and Kerry J. Ressler found that mice that received electric shocks whenever they smelled a certain chemical reminiscent of cherry blossom later showed signs of stress when presented with the smell, but not the electric shock.
What we found in the study was that conditioning animals or training them to associate a particular smell with this mild foot shock gives us descendant generations that are slightly more sensitive to this smell.
When the mice had pups, their offspring was separated from them and raised by other mice. The scientists then introduced the smell to the pups, who exhibited signs of stress, despite being raised by mice without a history of associating the scent with pain.
And what we found, shockingly, is that the neuroanatomical changes still persisted. That is, the brain still devoted more real estate to processing that cue that was salient to the ancestral generation.
The suggestion was that memories of traumatic events can be encoded into our DNA, which is something like 99% similar to mouse DNA, and passed on to our children. There have been criticisms of this study, but all the same, it feels true, doesn't it? Anecdotally, we know that hurt people hurt people. Our parents and teachers told us that the school bully was probably being bullied at home.
Trauma is actually, unlike what we first thought, extremely common. 1 out of 4 kids get beaten very hard by their parents. 1 out of 8 kids see physical fights between their parents.
I do a lot of work with men on death row and murder cases and imprisoned men, and what I've come to see them as mostly is untreated, traumatized children inhabiting the bodies of often very scary men. And one thing that makes them so scary is their unconsciousness about that wounded child and the anger of that child and the fear of that child. And now in a big body, they're doing things on behalf of that child without even an awareness of it.
Part 4. Revenge. Intergenerational trauma can manifest in patterns of harmful behaviour as each subsequent generation continues to behave in harmful ways due to upbringing mixed with inherited trauma.
It's obviously a place that had 30 years of low intensity conflict, as it's called, but it's actually to the individual. It's high intensity, it's in your face, you live with it every day, wake up every morning, and then that gets passed on down to their children because the people can't cope with their pain, they can't cope with their injury, and their children then start to pick up what's known as transgenerational trauma too. So we are a damaged society.
The Troubles is the blanket name for a series of conflicts in Northern Ireland between the 1960s and the 1990s, although the story dates back further than that. The threat of outbreaks of violence between those loyal to the state of the United Kingdom, usually Protestants, and those who wished for Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to unite as one fully independent state, usually Catholics, became an everyday part of life in Northern Ireland during the latter half of the 20th century. Though the roots of the conflict can be traced back to British imperialism and colonialism, there's no doubt that much of the day-to-day conflict between ordinary people was fueled in large part by revenge on both sides.
In this period of the early 1970s, both Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries engaged in bloody tit-for-tat struggles, revenge attacks, in which very often civilians were caught up in the middle of. Many of the devices are aimed at the business district of cities and towns, shops, and also at military targets as well. So the threat was very real for the civilian population, as invariably they were the ones who would be caught up in any blasts.
In Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets and the Montagues' ancient grudge is similarly fueled by revenge, and their constant street fights endanger the local population of Verona.
3 civil broils, bred of an airy word, by thee, O Capulet, and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets.
We see in the earliest conflicts of the play that the families will start fighting with little to no excuse.
Do you bite your thumb at us, sir?
I do bite my thumb, sir.
Do you bite your thumb at us, sir?
The climactic fight in Act 3 breaks out because Tybalt is so incensed at Romeo gate-crashing the Capulet party that he challenges him to a duel over the so-called injuries that he's done him.
This shall not excuse the injuries thou hast done me. Therefore turn and draw!
Again, this is over gate-crashing a party. Filling in for his attempt to refuse the duel, Romeo's friend Mercutio is killed by Tybalt when Romeo attempts to stop the fight.
Hold Tybalt! Good Mercutio! Ah! I'm hurt! Tybalt!
Immediately, Romeo vows revenge for his friend and kills Tybalt.
Alive in triumph, and Mercutio slain. Away to heaven, respective lenity and fire-eyed fury be my conduct now.
Mercutio's soul is but a little way above our heads, staying for thine to keep him company.
Either thou or I or both must go with him.
Thou wretched boy that didst consort him here shalt with his head.
Romeo flees before the prince arrives, along with the heads of the Montague and Capulet households, and the quest for revenge continues with Lady Capulet.
I beg for justice, which thou, prince, must give. Romeo slew Tybalt, Romeo must not live.
Later in the play, Juliet sees Tybalt's ghost.
Methinks I see my cousin's ghost, seeking out Romeo, that did spit his body upon a rapier's point.
Perhaps an omen of unfinished business, like the ghost of Hamlet's father who tells his son,
If thou didst ever thy dear father love, God, revenge, his foul and most unnatural murder.
So when two sides are embroiled in an intergenerational conflict that seemingly even continues after death, how does it end? In her 2001 work, Reflections on the Desire for Revenge, psychiatrist Dr. Sandra L. Bloom outlines our human predisposition for revenge and where it gets us as a society. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, demonstrates clear revenge-based behaviours, suggesting that there's a strong socio-evolutionary reason we developed this predisposition. Throughout history, revenge was dealt with in society through hereditary blood vengeance, where, if your family member is killed, you get to kill the murderer, or a member of the murderer's family, to even the score.
My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
But if you can't do that during the perpetrator's lifetime, the feud passes on to the next generation, making them the targets for revenge. Bloom says, in a cycle of revenge that has no prescribed limits, the original perpetrator rarely perceives what he or she did to the victim was as bad as the victim experienced it to be. So, when the victim responds, the perpetrator experiences the response as an escalation of aggression, creating another cycle of revenge. So, how do we break the cycle? Part 5. Justice. Though Shakespeare's era was a relatively stable time for England, deep religious tension between Protestants and Catholics still caused social unrest. It was also a time when laws were becoming more centralised and formalised. There was a growing emphasis on laws being passed through Parliament rather than through a process of a citizen going to speak to the monarch, who'd create laws based on each request. Bloom says, by the Elizabethan era, private revenge was publicly condemned because in taking revenge, man was usurping the role and prerogative of God. The monarch, and by extension the state, could, however, exact revenge because they did so in the name of God, as God's authorized agents.
And what we're looking at in Shakespeare's day is the sort of the moment where that's pivoting for England, where the individual enforcement of law and righteousness and morality is still with the individual, but you see the beginning of a judicial system that is going to take over the authority of enforcement of moral values. So you see people getting into street fights to protect their honor for things that today, or 200 years later, you would have gone to the courts or the police for.
Capulet and Montague have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets.
Most modern dress interpretations of Romeo and Juliet have the prince costumed as a cop, a symbol of the state and justice system, mirroring how Shakespeare's audiences would have understood his role. So, when in an act of hot-headed revenge Romeo kills Tybalt, what should the prince do? Well, what he said he'd do is,
if ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace.
But that's not what happens.
I beg for justice, which thou, prince, must give! Romeo slew Tybalt! Romeo must not live!
Romeo slew him. He slew Mercutio. Who now the price of his dear blood doth owe?
Not Romeo, prince. He was Mercutio's friend. His fault compels, but what the law doth end, the life of Tybalt.
And for that offence, immediately we do exile him hence.
The prince seems to recognise that there's a cycle of revenge. Instead of capital punishment, he banishes Romeo from the city. He then reveals for the first time that Mercutio is his own cousin, and maybe that's what triggered him to consider how else he can end this cycle.
I have an interest in your hate's proceeding. My blood for your rude brawls doth lie a-bleeding.
But at the same time says that he can't just let Romeo off.
Mercy, but murders, pardoning those that kill.
But, as we know, as fate directs, Romeo ends up back in Verona, goes to Juliet, and they both end up dead. Let's take a moment to think about banishment. It's easy for us in the 2020s to misunderstand the severity of banishment in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Banishment? Be merciful, say death.
For exile hath more terror in his look, much more than death. Do not say banishment.
Hence from Verona art thou banished. Be patient, for the world is broad and wide.
There is no world without Verona walls, but purgatory, torture, hell itself.
Hence, banished is banished from the world, and world's exile is death. Then banished is death mistermed.
Calling death banished, thou cuts my head off with a golden axe and smiles upon the stroke that murders me.
Banishment in Shakespeare's day meant you would probably never see your friends and family again, never speak to them again. You could write to them maybe, if you were able to read and write, but you'd never see them again in the flesh. Imagine 2020 lockdowns without technology. Not only are you alone in the world, but people in medieval and Renaissance England and Italy were often exiled to another country, where locals might not be as welcoming to a foreigner as they might be now. Though, as a nobleman, Romeo would have been able to live a comfortable life, many real-life exiles of the lower classes were shipped halfway across the world to labour on plantations in Australia and the Caribbean. Exile was historically seen as a less harsh punishment than execution. But in the play, banishment is so serious a punishment that Romeo tries to kill himself before the nurse and Friar Lawrence stop him, and Lady Montague dies of the grief of losing her son.
My wife is dead tonight. Grief at my son's exile had stopped her breath.
So since we don't really exile people anymore, what do we do with our criminals?
They put you in jail.
I need some prison jokes! Quick!
In her 2003 book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, philosopher, activist and author Angela Davis picks apart the US justice system and traces its history as far back as the 16th century and argues for the abolition of the modern prison system. She points out that historically, prisons were thought of as a more humane alternative to the physical torture and death penalties common in the medieval age through to Shakespeare's day, and that the prison as we know it today is a relatively new concept in human history.
The history of the prison is precisely the history of attempts to fix the system.
Imprisonment itself was new neither to the United States nor to the world, but until the creation of this new institution called the penitentiary, it served as a prelude to punishment. People who were to be subjected to some form of corporal punishment were detained in prison until the execution of the punishment. With the penitentiary, incarceration became the punishment itself. Other modes of punishments that predated the rise of the prison include banishment, forced labour in galleys, transportation, and appropriation of the accused's property. The punitive transportation of large numbers of people from England, for example, facilitated the initial colonisation of Australia. And so in the context of Romeo and Juliet, we could compare Romeo's banishment to imprisonment in that the punishment is essentially his removal from wider society. Like a prisoner, Romeo is cut off from his community and left to face the ramifications of his actions alone.
Let Romeo hence in haste!
From the prince's perspective, it's more likely to break the cycle and is more humane if he exiles Romeo rather than executing him. But it doesn't work. Romeo and Juliet still end up dead. Despite Friar Lawrence's best efforts to fix the situation through an elaborate scheme for Juliet to fake her own death and run away with Romeo, the fates conspire to stop the letter he sends to Romeo from ever reaching him.
I writ to Romeo that he should hither come on this dire night to help to take her from her borrowed grave, being the time the potion's force should cease. But he which bore my letter, Friar John, was stayed by accident, and yesternight returned my letter back.
Shakespeare was living through a time of major political upheaval, including, as we've seen, the emergence of the justice system as we know it today. Perhaps we can consider that his writing of the forces of fate interfering in the plot of Romeo and Juliet, following the prince's supposedly merciful decision, was his way of showing that the institutionalization of the revenge cycle will inevitably lead to ruin. One of the most severe punishments today is solitary confinement. Do these look like people being helped to reform to you? No one, not even the most ardent defenders of the supermax, would try to argue today that absolute segregation, including sensory deprivation, is restorative and healing. The prevailing justification for the Supermax is that the horrors it creates are the perfect complement for the horrifying personalities deemed the worst of the worst by the prison system.
These men described as the worst of the worst.
He says they have to constantly remind themselves that they're dealing with essentially the worst of the worst, and for that reason, they need to be ready for whatever risks they might face.
For inmates who get violent with other prisoners or guards,
we're going to close the door. I just want to get a sense of... Wow.
solitary confinement awaits.
The only light you get is through this hole. And they can be in here for 15 days, potentially. All right, I'm ready to get out.
In 2011, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture declared that considering the severe pain and suffering that solitary confinement can cause, it can amount to torture.
So, if you remember when we talked about how trauma causes conflicts for generations, you might see where this is going once these prisoners make it out. Equally, does this look like a group of people who'll adjust easily to society? Nayib Bukele has promised that these men will die in prison.
Un interno, media vez ingrese aquí al secot, no vuelve a salir.
But who knows what the future holds?
First entered prison in the 40s, Attica was famed for being impregnable. No way could you do anything with Attica because it was 4 different yards and they were separated. And these guys did do something.
There were a whole series of conditions that were degrading and inhumane, which led prisoners to begin to protest these conditions, and there was a general rebellion throughout the prison.
1,000 prisoners took over 4 cell blocks of Attica State Prison.
To me, this looks like a ticking time bomb.
There are rumors that there are children inside these cells.
Donald Trump has backed a proposal from El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele to send people here from the US.
We are learning more about the 238 Venezuelan men that the Trump administration recently deported to El Salvador. The Trump administration claims all of them are connected to Venezuelan gangs, but has not provided any evidence to that. What's happening in El Salvador is the establishment of a concentration camp. Anyone who agrees with what the U.S. and El Salvador are doing is a barbarian.
And don't think the UK is exempt from criticism.
England and Wales have the highest rate of incarceration in Western Europe. The prison system is operating at 99% of its usable operational capacity. Reoffending rates are also stubbornly high in England and Wales, hitting 80% in 2019, and are higher among offenders sentenced to less than 12 months in custody. Recent Tory ministers, like Suella Braverman, were far more heavy-handed, with policies like locking up asylum seekers and protesters.
In the coming weeks, asylum seekers will start to arrive in this tiny, idyllic community in Dorset, housed on the water, far from sight. High on the cliffs overlooking the Bibby Stockholm is one of Portland's 2 prisons. The government insists this barge isn't a third, despite the high metal fences and 24-hour security.
You might be thinking, well, these are particularly egregious and disgusting uses of prisons, but we need prisons. We need somewhere to send people who do wrong and to deter people from breaking the law. But if that were true and prisons worked, wouldn't we have stopped crime by now, hundreds of years after the invention of the modern prison system?
Reoffending is one of the greatest challenges facing justice systems worldwide. But could it be that prisons themselves are at the heart of this global problem?
On the outside, reoffending rates are high, exacerbating the existing problem.
When you realize all you're doing is sending the people to prison, and you're sending them over and over. When I start recognizing people the second, third, or fourth time they come through, you begin to think, wait a second, this isn't working. This is a bunch of BS.
As cited by Angela Davis, the 1997 documentary The Last Graduation shows the detrimental effects of the culling of prison education programs during the Clinton administration.
Prisoners very early, I think, recognized the fact that they needed to be better educated, that the more education they had, the better they would be able to deal with themselves and with their problems and with the problems of the prison and problems of communities from which most of them came.
these brothers grabbed me. They got me involved with these programs. These programs have helped build me. They have taught me and have educated me. Because these programs made me feel that I belong to something, that I am important, that I can make change. These are the things that these programs taught me, whereas the institution have failed me drastically, have created a monster, and that's what I was before I became a part of these programs. So it's very important that y'all understand that we need support, that we are trying to make a change, and that change can be made. Before, we was taught that we didn't belong to nothing. The only thing that we could have done to contribute to problems. Now we understand problems. Now the same hands that have destroyed the community are willing to rebuild them. Thank you.
Most of the men who worked in the prisons are now in the community. They're involved in working with young people, working with seniors, working with tenants.
In 1994, Bill Clinton passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which has since decimated communities across America, and included eliminating the Pell Grants, which funded education in prisons, demonstrating that the government did not consider the prison as a place for people to be reformed.
I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
They fell through the cracks when they were 5 years old and 10 years old and 11 years old. Somehow they got out of that crack when they were in prison, and they did that through education. And to destroy that is to destroy what we're all about, which is called rehabilitation.
The statistics prove that men who have taken up this experience and this opportunity and have gone back out into the communities stay out at a much larger percentage than others and turn themselves around, and that's the value of the program. And I thought that that was what our mission was in the Department of Correctional Services, was to be able to do that for the citizens of the state of New York.
If prisons are not places of reformation, then we have to consider them as a place for punishment, for retribution, for a form of state-sanctioned revenge by proxy. Back to Sandra Bloom. We have witnessed a dramatic swing from viewing imprisonment as an opportunity for rehabilitation to a vocal and insistent demand that prisons be as punitive as the law allows. The cycle of revenge self-perpetuates, giving it a fate-like quality caused by the failures of the justice system. As shown by reoffending statistics, traumatized prisoners who have been kept in this cycle by the state are almost fated to continue it on the outside. So finally, we come back to Romeo and Juliet. By dealing out a punitive, retributive form of justice, the prince has perpetuated the cycle, and so fate intervenes, punishing everyone, including himself, through the loss of his own family member.
Capulet, Montague, see what a scourge is laid upon your hate? That heaven finds means to kill your joys with love. And I, for winking at your discords too, have lost a brace of kinsmen. All are punished.
All are punished.
All are punished.
A society pays a high price for the relentless pursuit of blood revenge. Systems of law were designed to take revenge out of the hands of families and put the right of retaliation into the hands of authorities. Lying behind our system of justice, and even more thinly veiled in the last 2 decades than the ones just before, the desire for vengeance can be seen to derail common sense. Relatively little attention is paid to the fact that with this increasingly punitive response, we are failing to address the underlying problems of what is motivating so much antisocial behaviour. In fact, the response itself may be making the problem worse by escalating, not diminishing, the cycle of revenge. Many of Shakespeare's greatest plays speak to the issue of revenge, particularly Hamlet and Titus Andronicus, and revenge tragedies were a particular Elizabethan genre of play favoured by audiences. According to some traditional psychiatric accounts, suicide can sometimes be seen as expressing the desire for revenge, an aggression or partial killing of those who remain behind. Vengeance is a problem that must be shared and resolved in the complex interaction between the individual and his or her social group. Acts of revenge can be viewed as much as a failure of the social group as a failure of the individual. James Graham is one of the UK's most prolific living playwrights. His work unpicks big institutions like government, the media, or the England football team to create deeply human and intricate stories. His work's been adapted for TV, and he's also written for TV. You might remember the somewhat controversial miniseries Brexit, the Uncivil War, with Benedict Cumberbatch about Dominic Cummings' machinations leading to the results of the 2016 UK referendum, or Quiz with Matthew McFadden, following the real-life story of a former army major who cheated his way to winning the final round of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Graham's latest play, Punch, tells another real-life story, this time based on the autobiography of Jacob Dunn, who at 19 years old was found guilty of the manslaughter of 28-year-old James Hodgkinson, having killed him in a street brawl with a single punch. Looking for answers to their son's sudden death, James Hodgkinson's parents, Joan and David, began to work with Remedy, a UK-based restorative justice organisation who work to bring perpetrators and victims of crime into a healing dialogue. After serving 14 months in prison for his actions, Dunn was invited by Remedy to gradually begin conversations with Joan and David, at first by letters and later in person.
She said it, Nicola, about revenge.
Punitive.
Punitive.
Bloody hell, Joan.
She said the point of this isn't punitive to make him feel bad, so the phrasing has to be, why did you do it? Why did you do it?
Why did you do it?
Did he spill your drink?
Did they think that I...
Did he chat up a girl you were with?
They think I meant to, like, kill him. I didn't.
You want me to ask him that?
Ask him.
We've had lots of support, victim support, restorative justice, forgiveness project. They've all supported us through this. It's not a journey we started, to get to the end here. It started with just questions of that night, really.
Yeah, so we kept talking. I answered all their questions. I listened intently to the true impact that he'd had, what James was like as a person and his personality.
And then we asked Jacob what was he going to do with his life now. And I think he was a bit shocked.
Just a bit. And I guess that was the kind of springboard for me. It was that the people who I'd harmed the most were the ones that judged me the least. And that gave me the confidence to start trying to believe in myself and start trying to heal myself, because it's often hurt people that go around hurting people.
It sounds to me like the rehabilitation has started out of prison.
Oh yes, after prison. Prison done nothing for Jacob at all. He came out worse.
Yeah, I came out more angry, more bitter, because I would say that the people who are most likely to help someone turn their life around are those, those positive social relationships that they have within their community. And when you separate them from those people and isolate them.
And now you have a first in criminology, you work to stop gang violence, you're involved with the Reset pilot scheme, you're married with 2 children. Do you wake up some days and find it all a bit unbelievable?
It's hard to put into words. We heard.
So they rescued you?
Yeah, they held me to account, really. Their courage to hold me to account helped me start to reevaluate my own self.
Hate for hate only intensifies the existence of hate and evil in the universe. If I hit you and you hit me and I hit you back and you hit me back and go on, you see, that goes on ad infinitum. It just never ends. Somewhere somebody must have a little sense, and that's the strong person. The strong person is the person who can cut off the chain of hate, the chain of evil. And that is the tragedy of hate, that it doesn't cut it off. It only intensifies the existence of hate and evil in the universe. Somebody must have religion enough and morality enough to cut it off and inject within the very structure of the universe that strong, powerful element of love. We must discover the power of love, the redemptive power of love. And when we discover that, we will be able to make of this old world a new world